But Gerald Walsh wasn't a man who accepted public humiliation quietly. That evening, in the dim light of his study, he stared at a stack of financial reports that Alicia had helped leak to state investigators. The reports showed years of questionable transactions, land purchased for pennies on the dollar, city contracts awarded without bids, campaign contributions that violated state laws. Gerald knew the investigation wouldn't stop at him. It would drag his children, his allies, and half the Maplewood political apparatus down with him. For the first time in his career, the kingmaker of Maplewood was staring at a chessboard where his king was cornered. The arrest came 2 weeks later. State troopers escorted Gerald Walsh out of his estate in handcuffs, his face pale but composed. Charges included conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and multiple counts of fraud. Lindsay Walsh, who had sparked the chain of events with her slap, was subpoenaed to testify before a grand jury. Her lawyers urged her to leave town. The cameras caught her boarding a private jet with a single suitcase. For Elijah, the victory was not a moment of celebration, but of quiet resolve. The Walsh family's downfall didn't erase the slap, the threats, or the fear. It didn't change the fact that in Maplewood, power had been abused for decades while good people stayed silent. But it did prove something that Gerald Walsh had never believed possible, that even the most untouchable dynasty could be brought down by a single voice that refused to be silenced. On the day the state announced a full takeover of the Maplewood Police Department, Elijah returned to Jackson's Gas Convenience, the place where it had all begun. The summer sun was just as hot, the asphalt just as cracked, but the air felt different. Tyler, the young cashier, waved from inside, a small smile on his face. Elijah nodded back. As he filled his tank, a reporter approached, microphone in hand. "Mr. Carter," she said, "after everything that's happened, do you have a message for the people of Maplewood?" Elijah tightened the gas cap, looked into the camera, and spoke without hesitation. "Don't wait for someone else to stand up. You are that someone." He didn't stay for the reaction. He got in his car, started the engine, and drove away, not as a man who had been slapped and humiliated, but as the man who had turned that moment into the spark that burned an empire down. "If Carter wants to take this to the public square, we'll give him a show. Call the chief. It's time we reminded him how fragile his freedom is." That same afternoon, as Elijah locked the door of his house, 2 police cruisers rolled up, lights flashing. 4 officers stepped out, hands on their belts. The lead officer's voice was firm but rehearsed. "Elijah Carter, you're under arrest for suspicion of assault and property damage." The neighbors gathered, phones out, recording. Elijah didn't resist. He met the officer's gaze and said evenly, "Make sure you get my good side. This time, the whole world's watching." The fall of the House of Walsh. The holding cell in the Maplewood police station was small, cold, and smelled faintly of disinfectant. Elijah sat on the metal bench, back straight, hands clasped loosely in front of him. He knew this arrest wasn't about justice. It was theater, staged for the cameras and the evening news. The goal was simple: put him in handcuffs, stain his reputation, and scare anyone else who might dare to challenge the Walsh family. But as the hours passed and the murmurs from the other side of the bars drifted in, Elijah realized something had shifted. The officers weren't speaking with the usual mocking confidence he'd come to expect. Their voices carried an edge of unease. By the time Alicia arrived to bail him out, the unease had a name. "The state's attorney has opened a preliminary investigation into Gerald Walsh and the Maplewood Police Department," she said as they walked past the booking desk. "The Briarwood footage, the intimidation, the arrest, it's all on the table now. The timing couldn't be better. Your arraignment hearing will be public, and I've already arranged for multiple media outlets to be there." The courthouse steps the morning of the hearing looked like the front line of a siege. Reporters crowded together, mic rum, phones in hand, shouting questions over the roar of generators powering camera crews. Elijah walked up the stone steps in a dark suit, Alicia at his side, and the crowd parted like a wave. For years, the Walsh family had controlled the narrative in Maplewood through money and fear. Today, Elijah was taking the narrative back. Inside the courtroom, the district attorney, a thin man with a sharp voice who owed his career to Walsh money, read the charges with a smug precision: assault, property damage, disturbing the peace. But when the judge, an older woman with a reputation for independence, asked for the evidence, Alicia rose to her feet. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady and clear, "the state's case relies on an incident they claim occurred at Briarwood Industrial Park. What they will not tell you, but what I will show you, is that this incident was manufactured by agents of the Walsh family in an attempt to entrap my client." She nodded toward the clerk and the lights dimmed as the Briarwood footage played on the screen for the court. Every detail was there, the men arriving before Elijah, the stage shouting, the blocked path, the moment Alicia's car arrived to intervene. And then the critical shot, one of the men driving straight into the Walsh estate gates. The courtroom was silent when the lights came back on. The district attorney shifted uncomfortably, flipping through his notes as though the answer might be hidden somewhere on the page. The judge's voice cut through the quiet like a blade. "Case dismissed, and I suggest the state reconsider its alliances before bringing such matters to my court again." Outside, the crowd erupted. Reporters shouted questions. Some locals cheered, others jeered. But the noise was different now. Not the one-sided jeering of a town under control, but the messy, unpredictable noise of a community realizing the cracks in its own foundations. Elijah didn't speak to the cameras. He let the footage and the dismissal speak for him. The decision was made for them 3 days later when a leak they hadn't authorized hit the local press. It wasn't the full Briarwood video, just a 30-second clip showing two of Gerald Walsh's known associates confronting Elijah in that deserted lot. It was enough to cause a stir, but without Alicia's complete footage, the Walsh family's allies moved fast to frame it as misunderstood. Local news anchors repeated the same talking points. Elijah had placed himself in a volatile situation and was known to associate with troublemakers. The language was carefully chosen to sound impartial while planting seeds of doubt. But the leak had unintended consequences for the Walshes. Once the footage was out, people who had been silent began to talk. Anonymous emails poured into Alicia's encrypted inbox. Tips about shady land deals, unexplained financial transfers, even a police report from years ago in which Lindsay Walsh had been involved in a hit-and-run that mysteriously vanished from the record. Some were unverifiable, others damning. Each one was another crack in the Walsh's armor. The tension in Maplewood became impossible to ignore. Conversations in diners stopped when Elijah walked in, but now half the stares were no longer cold. They were cautious, even supportive. Some people nodded subtly as if to say, "Keep going." Others glared openly, as if daring him to push further. The town was dividing itself, one whispered conversation at a time. It was on the 4th day after the leak that the real danger came. Elijah was driving home from meeting a journalist in the neighboring city when he noticed headlights in his rearview mirror. At first he thought it was coincidence. Maplewood roads were quiet at night. But the car stayed with him through 3 turns. He took a longer route toward his street, and the headlights followed. Finally, as he turned onto the road leading to his house, the car sped forward, cutting him off. 2 men stepped out, both in dark jackets, one holding what looked like a length of steel pipe. "You need to stop poking around in things you don't understand," the taller one said, his voice flat, almost bored. Elijah's heart pounded, but before he could respond, the other man swung the pipe down onto the hood of his car, denting the metal with a loud crack. The taller man stepped closer. "Last warning, Carter. You walk away now. You keep your life quiet. You keep pushing, and your life ends up very loud, very fast." It was then that a second set of headlights flared from the opposite end of the street. Alicia's unmarked sedan rolled up, and in one smooth motion, she stepped out with her phone already recording. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying, "I'd love to hear that thread again for the camera." The 2 men froze, eyes narrowing, before one muttered something under his breath, and both retreated to their car. Tires squealed as they sped away. Elijah exhaled slowly, his hands still tight on the steering wheel. "They're getting bolder," he said, watching the taillights vanish. "They're getting desperate," Alicia corrected, "and desperate people make mistakes. We just have to be ready to catch them." The next morning, Maplewood woke to its first true fracture. An independent state news outlet ran an investigative piece that not only included the full Briarwood footage but also highlighted a pattern of intimidation connected to the Walsh family, including anonymous witness statements from former employees. It was the first time in years that a publication had dared print something so direct. For Gerald Walsh, it was a declaration of war. In his study, he listened to his fixer Vincent list the fallout, state investigators asking questions, donors hesitating to fund their political allies. Wow. Whispers of federal attention. Gerald didn't slam his fist or raise his voice. Instead, he poured himself a drink, stared out the window at his perfectly kept lawn, and said, "It took Elijah half a second to piece it together. The camera, the shouting, the carefully staged fear. This was the trap. They were trying to capture him on video looking aggressive, something they could splice into a narrative of violence. His first instinct was to walk away, but the man with the camcorder blocked his path. "Say something now," the cameraman taunted. "Defend yourself." Elijah took a slow breath, forcing his voice to stay level. "You're trying to stage this. I'm not playing your game." He stepped sideways, refusing to let them corner him, when headlights swept across the lot. A car rolled up fast, tires crunching gravel, and Alicia Monroe stepped out, badge in hand. "Put the cameras down," she said sharply, her voice carrying that unshakable authority police officers used when they knew they were in the right. The men froze, their expressions tightening. Alicia walked straight to Elijah without looking away from them. "I've been recording since I pulled in," she said low enough for only him to hear. "We've got them." Later that night in her apartment, Alicia showed him the footage she had captured. Every second of their attempt to bait him, every face clear under the overhead lights. But the real gift was what came after. Alicia had followed one of the men as he drove away from Briarwood. He didn't go home. He drove straight to the gated entrance of the Walsh estate. "This," Alicia said, tapping the screen, "is the bolt we've been looking for. We've now got a direct connection between Gerald's people and an attempted entrapment. With the right push, this could break through the wall they've built." Elijah sat back, the weight of the evening settling on him. They hadn't just survived the trap, they'd turned it into evidence. For the first time since the slap at the gas station, he felt the balance of the fight shift, even if only slightly. But victories in Maplewood were never without cost. The next morning, his sister Monica found her car tires slashed, a thin envelope taped to the windshield. Inside was a single photograph. Elijah walking into Alicia's apartment the night before. No threats written, no names, just an image. It was enough to make the message clear. We're still watching, and we can reach anyone you care about. Gerald Walsh, sitting in his study with a morning paper and black coffee, read the latest reports about the Briarwood incident. His fixer, Vincent Hale, stood nearby, uneasy. "Sir," Hale said quietly, "they've got us on tape. If this gets out—" Gerald lowered the paper, a thin smile playing on his lips. "Then we make sure it doesn't. And if it does, we make sure no one believes it." What neither of them realized was that the footage was already beyond their reach, copied, encrypted, and stored in 3 separate locations. Alicia had made sure of it, and somewhere in the quiet space between fear and resolve, Elijah began to understand something vital. He wasn't just defending himself anymore. He was building a case that could burn the Walsh dynasty to the ground. The boiling point. The footage from Briarwood had been encrypted and stored in 3 separate locations, but keeping it hidden forever was never the plan. Alicia knew the Walshes thrived in the shadows, where whispers never became headlines and rumors were smothered before they could grow roots. To break them, the fight had to be dragged into the light. The problem was timing, released too early and they'd dismiss it as fabricated. Wait too long, and the Walsh machine would crush Elijah before the truth had a chance to breathe. They showed a heavily edited version of the video, cutting out the slap entirely and adding misleading captions. The piece ended with a thinly veiled warning from the anchor. Perhaps it's time for Mr. Carter to focus on his teaching rather than stirring division in our community. It might have worked if not for the internet. Within hours, side-by-side comparisons of the edited clip and the original footage went viral. Larger media outlets picked up the discrepancy, and now the question wasn't whether Lindsay had slapped Elijah, It was why Maplewood's media was lying to protect her. That evening, Elijah met Alicia again, this time in the back room of a closed-down diner owned by one of her trusted contacts. The place smelled faintly of coffee and dust, the lights kept low. Alicia spread out a rough timeline on the table. Incidents from the last 15 years where the Walshes had used their influence to crush opposition. There were suspicious business deals, criminal cases that vanished, and a chilling number of deaths labeled as accidents. If we connect enough dots, Alicia said, we can take this higher, outside Maplewood. But we'll need proof that can't be ignored or buried. That means going after their financials. Elijah leaned back, processing the scale of what she was proposing. You're talking about taking down an entire machine, he said. I'm talking about pulling the one bolt that makes the whole thing collapse, she replied. Neither of them noticed the faint click from outside the diner window, the sound of a camera shutter. Across the street, in the dark interior of the black SUV, a man lowered a long-lens camera and made a call. They're meeting, he said, and it's bigger than we thought. Somewhere in the Walsh estate, Gerald listened to the report and smiled faintly. The teacher thought he was building a case. Gerald knew he was building a trap. The trap at Briarwood. 2 days later, Elijah's week had settled into a rhythm of guarded normalcy. Mornings spent answering messages from journalists he didn't fully trust, afternoons in cautious meetings with Alicia to review documents, evenings walking the perimeter of his house just to be sure no one had been inside. He was learning that fighting the Walsh family meant living in a constant state of readiness. Yet there was no preparing for the moment a fight suddenly accelerates when the other side decides to stop circling and make contact. That moment came on a Thursday evening when his phone lit up with a call from an unknown number. The voice on the other end belonged to a young woman who sounded frantic. She claimed her name was Kara, a former student of Elijah's, and said she'd been in an accident on the edge of town near Briarwood Industrial Park. Please, she begged, her voice trembling. You're the only person I trust. I think they're following me. The line cut before Elijah could ask more questions. His instincts screamed that something was wrong, but the teacher in him, the man who had promised to protect his students, couldn't ignore it. He grabbed his keys and drove. Briarwood was half abandoned, a sprawl of warehouses and cracked asphalt where weeds grew tall through the pavement. As Elijah pulled in, he spotted a dark sedan with its hazard lights blinking. He got out, scanning the area, calling Kara's name. No answer. Then, from behind a row of loading docks, 2 figures emerged. Men in plain clothes, one holding a smartphone, the other pointing a small camcorder at him. A third man stepped into view, clutching his arm and shouting, "That's him! He threatened me!" Elijah leaned forward in his chair, the darkness of his living room pressing in around him. "Why are you telling me this?" There was a pause, then Alicia's voice softened. "Because 10 years ago they did this to my brother. He didn't make it out." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Alicia continued, her words clipped and deliberate. "I can't move against them alone, but I have files, real evidence, that show how far their reach goes. If you want to fight back, I'll help you. But you need to understand, once you start, there's no going back." Elijah thought of the slap, the humiliation, the threats, the way the town had turned its face away. He thought of the students he'd taught about justice, courage, and standing on the right side of history. And he knew his answer before she even finished speaking. "I'm already in it," he said. "So let's see how deep this goes." Across town, in the darkness of the Walsh Estate's library, Gerald poured himself another drink. He was certain the matter would be resolved within the week, but for the first time in decades, there was a quiet, invisible movement in Maplewood that wasn't under his control. The first move in the shadows. The morning after Detective Alicia Monroe's call, Elijah woke to a new kind of clarity. The fear was still there, a low, steady hum in his chest. But it was no longer the kind that made him want to hide. It was the kind that sharpened a man's senses. He knew the Walsh family wouldn't sit idle. Gerald Walsh was too seasoned a power broker to let a story spiral without pushing back. What Elijah didn't yet know was what form that pushback would take. Alicia met him in the parking lot behind a half-empty strip mall on the edge of town. She drove an older Navy sedan with no police markings, the kind of car no one would notice twice. When she stepped out, Elijah saw the guarded focus in her eyes. This was a woman who measured every word. She handed him a plain manila envelope. Inside were printed copies of internal memos, emails, and handwritten notes. The documents linked Maplewood's police chief, the district attorney, and several city council members directly to favors and cover-ups for the Walsh family. One memo in particular made Elijah's stomach tighten. It referenced containing the fallout from the gas station incident, including targeted public discrediting of him. "This is just a taste," Alicia said, scanning the lot for anyone watching. "The real files are digital, encrypted, and hidden where the Walshes can't touch them. I'll show you how to access them when the time is right." The more Elijah read, the clearer the picture became. Maplewood wasn't just a small town with a powerful family. It was a closed circuit of influence. The Walshes didn't just pull strings. They owned the stage, the curtains, and the audience. Any resistance was either absorbed quietly or erased completely. That afternoon, the first counterstrike came. As Elijah returned home from buying groceries, he noticed a black SUV idling at the corner of his street. The windows were tinted, the engine running. Two men in dark suits sat inside, their eyes hidden behind sunglasses. They didn't approach, they just watched. Elijah carried his bags inside without breaking stride, but his pulse quickened. Less than an hour later, his phone buzzed with a new message. An untraceable number, just a single sentence. "You're being given a chance to walk away. Take it." He forwarded the message to Alicia, who called immediately. "That's them testing your nerves," she said. "If you show them fear, they'll double down. If you ignore them, they'll escalate." True to her prediction, escalation came fast. The next day, a local news outlet, one the Walsh family quietly funded, ran a segment accusing Elijah of creating a public disturbance and verbally provoking Lindsay at the gas station. And the more he thought about it, the more one truth crystallized. He couldn't walk away. If he did, they'd keep doing it. To him, to others, to anyone who couldn't fight back. Somewhere across town in the Walsh family's dimly lit study, Gerald was on the phone with Maplewood's police chief, a longtime ally. "I don't care what you have to do," Gerald said, his voice low but firm. "Discredit him. Make him look like the aggressor. And for God's sake, find something in his past we can use. I want this man finished." Pressure from all sides. By the third day after the gas station incident, Maplewood didn't feel like home anymore. Elijah had lived here nearly his entire life, yet the town's familiar streets now carried a strange, uneasy weight. Neighbors who once waved from their porches now glanced away as he passed, their faces tight with caution, as if acknowledging him might invite trouble. In a place as small as Maplewood, silence was rarely neutral. It was often a choice, and Elijah could feel the choice being made in real time. It started with a phone call from the principal of Maplewood High School. The tone was polite, but the message was clear. There's concern about the attention this situation is bringing to the school. The board thinks it might be best if you take an extended leave, just until things settle down. Elijah sat in his kitchen, the phone pressed to his ear, and felt the words land like stones. He wasn't being accused of anything officially, but the implication was that his presence was now a liability. When he asked if the request came from the board or from outside pressure, there was a long pause before the principal sighed. "Elijah, you know how this town works." By noon that same day, the pressure became physical. As he drove toward the grocery store, red and blue lights flared in his rearview mirror. Officer Dan Whitmore, a man who had been in Elijah's graduating class, leaned into the driver's side window with an exaggerated smirk. "License and registration," he said, as if they'd never known each other. When Elijah asked the reason for the stop, Whitmore claimed his taillight was out. It wasn't. The stop lasted 20 minutes, long enough for passing drivers to see, long enough for the message to be clear: "We're watching you." That night, Monica urged him to stay with her for a while, worried about what might come next. Elijah appreciated her concern but refused. "If I leave my home now, I'll never be able to come back," he said. He'd seen this kind of intimidation before, slow, deliberate, designed to make a person shrink until they vanished. He would not give them that satisfaction. What Elijah didn't know was that in the Walsh estate, Gerald was growing frustrated. The video hadn't disappeared. If anything, it had spread further, with national reporters now asking for interviews. Attempts to discredit Elijah had failed so far. No criminal record, no scandal, no dirt. Gerald wasn't used to running into walls, so he turned to his most trusted fixer, a retired lawyer named Vincent Hale, who specialized in manufacturing problems where none existed. It was just after midnight when Elijah's phone buzzed with a number he didn't recognize. Normally, he would have ignored it, but something made him answer. A woman's voice came through, low and urgent. "Mr. Carter, my name is Detective Alicia Monroe. I'm not calling you officially. If my department knew I was speaking to you, I'd be out of a job." Her voice carried a controlled tension, the sound of someone aware they were stepping onto dangerous ground. "I've seen the orders coming down about you, from the Walsh family to the police chief, from the chief to the patrol officers. They want to trap you in something that makes you look violent or unstable. I've seen them do it before. If you're smart, you'll start documenting everything, and you'll need people who aren't afraid of the Walshes." The video that shook Maplewood, the sting on Elijah's cheek had barely faded when Lindsay turned her back on him, striding toward her black luxury SUV with the smugness of someone who had spent her life certain there would be no consequences. The slap still echoed in his mind, not because of the pain, but because of the weight behind it, the kind of weight that came from generations of entitlement pressing down on someone else. Elijah wasn't the kind of man who sought confrontation, but as he watched her pull open her car door, a flicker of something colder than anger settled in his chest. He didn't move toward her, didn't raise his voice, but he did what would change everything. He looked directly into the gas station's security camera mounted above the pump, then back at her retreating figure. It was a silent acknowledgement. The truth was already recorded. Inside the store, Tyler the cashier stood frozen, holding a phone he'd quietly used to film the entire exchange from behind the counter. His hands shook, not from fear but from knowing he'd captured something that wasn't supposed to be seen, not in Maplewood, not involving the Walsh family. By the time Elijah walked inside to pay, Tyler's video had already been sent to 3 friends, one of whom had an audience on social media large enough to make the clip impossible to contain. Elijah didn't even know yet that the footage was spreading like wildfire. By the time he reached his sister's house 30 minutes later, his phone buzzed with messages from colleagues, former students, and even an old college roommate he hadn't spoken to in years. The text came in a mix of disbelief and outrage. "Was that you? I can't believe she did that. It's already on Facebook and Instagram." When his sister Monica opened the door, her eyes were wide and she held up her phone. "Elijah, this has over 50,000 views already. 80. It's been 2 hours. Lindsay Walsh, meanwhile, had returned home to the sprawling Walsh estate, a colonial-style mansion that sat on 3 acres of perfectly manicured land. Her father, Gerald Walsh, was in his study, sipping whiskey when she stormed in. He was a man in his late 60s, the kind of small-town kingmaker whose influence didn't come from holding office but from owning the people who did. He listened in silence as Lindsay recounted her humiliation at the gas station, conveniently leaving out her own actions. When she finished, Gerald's expression was calm, but his eyes hardened. "Don't worry about it. I'll make a few calls. This will disappear by tomorrow." But the problem with the digital age was that no amount of influence could stop something already living in the bloodstream of the internet. By the next morning, the video had reached national outrage accounts, and news outlets were calling the Walsh family for comment. The narrative had shifted. This wasn't just a slap. It was a story about power, race, and corruption in a picture-perfect small town. And the people of Maplewood, many of whom had quietly endured the Walsh family's grip for decades, were beginning to whisper. Elijah sat at his kitchen table with Monica, scrolling through comment threads. Most were in his favor, but the backlash from the Walsh loyalists was vicious. Anonymous accounts accused him of provoking Lindsay, of editing the video to make her look bad, of being an outsider who didn't understand Maplewood's way of life. Despite having been born there, one comment chilled him more than the others. "You should watch your back. Accidents happen." That night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Elijah understood something. This wasn't just about a slap anymore. It wasn't even just about him. This was about a system built to protect people like Lindsay at the expense of people like him. White woman slaps black man at gas station. She never saw his response coming. The summer sun hung heavy over Maplewood, turning the cracked asphalt of Jackson's gas convenience into a shimmering heat trap. Cars moved slowly through the lot, their engines humming in the oppressive warmth. Elijah Carter pulled his silver Honda Accord into an empty pump, the air conditioner still blasting cold air into the cabin. He sat for a second longer than he needed to, knowing that stepping out would mean surrendering himself to the sticky air. At 33, Elijah was a man who valued peace. As a high school history teacher, his days were usually full of noise, students asking questions, the faint hum of the school's ancient air system, bells ringing. But summer break had given him rare, quiet days. He had been on his way to visit his sister, a trip he looked forward to, when fate decided to change his afternoon. Through the gas station's glass storefront, something caught his eye. Inside, a woman with highlighted blonde hair stood at the counter, her voice raised, her movements sharp and impatient. Even without hearing her words, Elijah could read the tension in her body. The young cashier, no older than 20, wore an awkward smile and a name tag that read Tyler. The woman's name was Lindsay Walsh, though Elijah didn't know it yet. To him, she was just another upset customer. But to Maplewood, she was the youngest daughter of the Walsh family. A name that opened doors and closed mouths. "I said," Lindsay snapped, slamming her manicured hand against the counter, "I want to speak to the manager. This is the third time your pumps have overcharged me." Tyler glanced at the receipt. "Ma'am, the total is correct. I'm sorry, but the manager isn't here right now." "That's not good enough." Her voice was sharp enough to slice through glass. "Call him, now." Elijah shook his head, returning his attention to the pump. Small-town drama wasn't his business, but then fate pulled him in. The station door swung open, and Lindsay marched out with the kind of confidence that came from knowing you were untouchable. She spotted Elijah, the only other customer outside, and for reasons he would never fully understand, her anger found a new target. "You," she said, pointing at him like a judge delivering a verdict. "Did you see how rude he was to me?" Elijah blinked. "I don't know what you're talking about, ma'am." Her lip curled. "Of course you don't. You people never pay attention unless it's about you." The words hit him harder than the heat. He wasn't sure if it was the casual venom or the way she said "you people" that made his chest tighten. "Look, I'm just..." The slap came so fast he didn't even have time to flinch. The sharp crack echoed across the lot, making a man by the ice machine turn his head. For a moment, everything froze. Lindsay smirked as if she had just swatted a fly. She turned, ready to walk away, confident the world would carry on exactly as it always had, with her untouchable and him silent. But when Elijah's voice finally came, it was calm, almost too calm. "Ma'am," he said, "you just made the biggest mistake of your life." He didn't raise his hand, he didn't step closer, but the way he looked at her made the smirk falter. In that moment, she had no idea that a single slap, captured on a security camera above them, was about to rip open every dark secret her family had buried,